Hi, I'm Adam. I work for Rivet Games as a software engineer, and I work on the locomotive setup. I'm going to show about how the setup works in DSW and the different components that we have. So we've got three different components for the simulation of the train. There's in the simulation we have an RVM, which is a rail vehicle model component, an RVV, which is a rail vehicle view component, and then a simulation component of the simograph. The simograph is created by Dovetail, and that's sort of like a bespoke train simulation thing where you can put all sorts of real world values into it, and you don't really hard code it like you would with a normal thing. You just put the real world values in and it should just work, and that helps get a lot of the nuances of trains. Most of the time I'm working within the RVV and the RVM. The RVV is where I set up all of the visual aspects, I suppose. It's where I would set up animations and I would set up any kind of things that need to be clickable. All of these red boxes around here in the cab controls are individually placed and sort of sized so that when the player moves their mouse over it, they can click it. After they have clicked it, then it would come into the RVM component, and this would have each of the individual things. So for example, the master key is a push button, so this tells it what is it supposed to do when it has been clicked. So I have this set up so that we have a generic base class which has got functionality for something that would happen in most trains. So it's got things like passenger doors, cab lights, headlights, maybe wipers. All of these things are set up with some kind of default functionality. So for example, the cab lights are set to turn on or off some kind of texture, but then when you're setting up a specific train, so for example in the case of the 150, I would go into a specific child created from this blueprint and then apply the specifics for that. So for example, that cab lights that we just had there, this is the cab lights component that I was setting in the base. I've sort of overridden it and added in the specific spotlights and textures that are supposed to come on for the class 150. And that goes the same for any event. If there's something in the generic version that I don't want it to do like that, I can just override that function and do something different. But it saves a lot of time being able to do it like this. And then everything that's obviously specific will just be done directly into the RVV here. From the 150 has two different sort of cabs, so units that we're making. We've got the DMS and the DMSL, so that's just with a toilet and without a toilet. And so these are children, but these are almost identical and have very little different with them. The main thing that is different is that the model component is switched, and so this one doesn't have the toilet, whereas the DMSL version would have one. For the 150, or for any train, we have to do quite a bit of research first, and that's sort of the beginning of any project, is going to be trying to gather as much reference material as we can and find out how this train works in real life. Sometimes, like in the case of the G442 on the Rosa line, we managed to get some, like the proper train manual from RHB, which was really, really helpful for setting all these things up. For the 150, although we had some contacts, we didn't have as much detail. And so a lot of it was going on Google and trying to find out what's going on. The artists have a lot of reference for like pictures and things, which can be helpful for me, but for the most part, it's not as helpful for me. I need to know quite specific things, particularly for the simulation. So for this one, I spent quite a bit of time at the beginning trying to find the specific values, so the gear ratios and sizes and things attached to the engine of this specific one. It's fairly easy to find some information about it, but I needed to find very, very specific information. And so it was pretty tricky to find. Because this train is old, a lot of the information doesn't really exist anymore. It's easy to find this kind of stuff on manufacturer websites, you can find it up-to-date ones for the newest version fairly easily, but trying to go back and find ones that they did, I think this one's set in the 90s, it's pretty tricky to find the information that I needed, but I was able to find it, and that's been added into the Simulgraph now. The other things for looking at research is trying to find out what do all of the specific buttons do in the cab. Some of them are pretty obvious. So for example, you've got a sander button, so that's just going to put the sand down, but then if you've got I don't know, you've got a signal, you need to make sure that that's doing all of the functionality that it needs to have, all of these buttons here, and there's always a decision of which ones are we going to implement and which ones is it going to take too much time or isn't going to really work for a gameplay aspect. We try to model as much stuff as we can, especially important features, for example, safety features like this DRA will implement, or the TPWS. And then obviously there's a bit of research trying to make sure that that stuff is modeled accurately as it is in real life. So the first thing that I do after I get the model, and I've done some of my initial research, is I try to set something up that's going to be drivable. There's certain things that we need to get working so that we can start in the gameplay, so that we can sort of run and test the scenarios, and it's not necessary for a lot of the stuff to be in the game in order to complete those objectives. The main things that are required are going to be the ability to apply throttle and drive the train forwards and backwards with a reverser. You're going to need to have at least one kind of brake so you can stop the train, and you're going to need the ability to open up the doors and load passengers. The passengers tend to be the more complicated of the systems. In order to get the passengers to work, you've got to have like a spline that they can attach to and walk into, and then a spawn volume. This is just the initial setup that I had, where I had a single seat, so the passengers would come in and there would be one space for a passenger and they could just sit on the single seat, but that's enough to get the gameplay working. And the same thing is over here. Before I've got a cab model or anything like that, I've set up a bunch of boxes with controls. So you've got, I think this one's like a master key, and then I put my throttle and reverser. I think I even had a test of some of the safety systems and an AWS button. So this was sort of the initial setup that I had, and then after I've got all of this stuff going so that gameplay can begin, I'll start working on the more bespoke things to this train. Then I end up, at some point I'll get a cab model. It doesn't usually look as pretty as this to begin with. It'll be just some kind of grey outline, but that's enough for me to be able to place all of those red boxes around each of the controls, and then I can start testing if everything's moving, adding in some of the animations, and getting everything up to what you can see here. When we're setting up the trains, an important aspect is to be able to make sure that each of the trains, or each of the pieces of the unit, are speaking to each other, and we do this through jumper cables. So we have Dovetail set up a sort of signaling system where you can send a message from one train and then it goes down all of the trains and tells it to do something. So this is most obvious with the train lighting. So if I turn off the train lighting there, it'll go off in both of the cabs, and then if I turn it on again, it's got them on in both sides. So that's done through sort of a messaging system. For the 150, it's not got that many things that it sends messages down the train, because it's quite an old train. For the tail lights, on a lot of trains, the tail light switch, that if I was sitting here and I could turn the tail light switch on, I would be able to control the rear tail lights. For the 150, it doesn't do that. It doesn't send any messages down. So this was quite a simple one, where the tail light switch here just turns off and on the tail lights at the very front cab. So if you want to have the correct ones on, you're going to need to walk down to the end and turn them on, just like in real life. Pretty much anything that we decide to, like any switch that we have that's clickable, is going to do something. There's no like dummy switches that do absolutely nothing. The compressor, for example, does affect the simulation, and it will speed up the compressor and the speed at which the air is going to fill up in the reservoir. Some things are as simple as like this fan is just an animation. It doesn't actually do any kind of simulation as such. Or back here when we've got the heater is just going to be a sound that sounds like the heater's on, but it's like details like that sort of add to the immersion of things. And we try to get as many of these little switches clickable as we can. Thanks very much for watching. I hope that everybody enjoys the content coming out from us at the moment. I spent quite a lot of time on the 150. Hopefully it's paid off. Hopefully you guys will appreciate the small details. If you want to see more content like this, let us know by liking, subscribing, telling us however you tell us. Maybe I'll come back another time and do another one.